I didn't say anything when Karen Morrison stood up at the emergency HOA meeting, her face red with indignation, demanding that I be fined into compliance. I just reached into my briefcase, pulled out the original 1987 utility easement agreement, and slid it across the conference table to their lawyer. The color drained from his face so fast, I thought he might actually faint. Karen kept ranting about property values and neighborhood aesthetics for another 30 seconds before she noticed the lawyer frantically whispering something in the HOA president's ear. That's when the room went completely silent, and I finally spoke up. It's Mrs. Morrison. According to this document, the power line that feeds electricity to your house crosses my property. And as of tomorrow, I'm exercising my right to revoke access. 3 months earlier, none of this would have mattered to me. I'd moved into the Willowbrook subdivision specifically because it was quiet, established, and seemed like the kind of place where people minded their own business. My wife Sarah and I had been renting a cramped apartment downtown while saving up for our first house, and after 2 years of listening to sirens and car alarms, we were desperate for some peace. The house we bought was a modest 3-bedroom ranch on the edge of the neighborhood, backing up to a small wooded area that gave us privacy from the neighbors. It wasn't fancy, but it had good bones and a south-facing roof that got full sun exposure all day long. It's perfect for the solar panel installation. I'd been planning since we started house hunting. I'd always been interested in renewable energy, partly because of my engineering background and partly because I hated the idea of paying the electric company more money than necessary every month. Sarah was supportive, especially after I showed her the calculations on how much we'd save over the long term. We'd budgeted for the installation as part of our moving expenses. And I'd already gotten quotes from 3 different companies before we even closed on the house. The plan was simple. Get settled, get the panels installed, start saving money, enjoy our quiet suburban life. The installation went smoothly. I'd pulled all the necessary permits with the county, had the electrical work inspected, and even called the utility company to coordinate the grid tin. The solar company I hired was professional and efficient, and they finished the job in 2 days. The panels weren't exactly pretty, I'll admit that, but they were functional and properly installed according to all local codes. They covered about 60% of our south-facing roof slope, ranged in neat rows that generated enough power to cover most of our electricity usage. For the first few weeks after installation, I found myself checking the monitoring app on my phone multiple times a day, watching the kilowatt hours add up and calculating how much money we were saving. That's when I got the first letter. It arrived on a Tuesday, printed on official HOA letterhead, and the subject line made my stomach drop. Notice of covenant violation, unauthorized exterior modifications. According to the letter, my solar panels were in violation of Section 4.2.7 of the Neighborhood Covenants, which required pre-approval for any exterior modifications visible from the street. I was being assessed a fine of $200 and given 30 days to either obtain retroactive approval or remove the panels entirely. I read the letter 3 times, trying to make sense of it. I'd reviewed the HOA covenants before we bought the house, specifically looking for any restrictions on solar installations, and I hadn't seen anything that would prohibit them. I dug out our copy of the covenant documents and spent an hour going through every page. Section 4.2.7 did exist, but it was specifically about additions and structural modifications like decks, sheds, and room additions. There was nothing in the language that would reasonably apply to solar panels, which were installed flush with the existing roofline and didn't change the structure of the house in any way. I decided to handle this diplomatically. I drafted a respectful email to the HOA board explaining that I believed there had been a misunderstanding. Included photos showing that the panels were professionally installed and code compliant, and attached documentation from the county showing that all proper permits had been obtained. I also included several state statutes that specifically protected homeowners' rights to install solar energy systems, hoping that would end the matter quickly and amicably. The response I got back was not what I expected. Instead of acknowledging my points or opening a dialogue, I received an even more formal letter stating that my appeal had been reviewed and denied, and that my fine had been increased to $400 for failure to comply with initial notice. The letter was signed by Karen Morrison, HOA president, and it included a thinly veiled threat about additional fines and potential legal action if I didn't remove the panels within 2 weeks. That night, Sarah and I sat at the kitchen table trying to figure out what to do. We'd stretched our budget to buy the house and pay for the solar installation, and we couldn't afford to just throw away a $15,000 investment because some busybody neighbor didn't like how it looked. But we also couldn't afford a legal battle with the HOA, especially not when we were just starting to build our life in this neighborhood. Sarah suggested that maybe we could find some kind of compromise, perhaps by screening the panels with landscaping or painting them a different color. I decided to try one more diplomatic approach. I requested a meeting with the HOA board, thinking that if I could explain the situation in person and show them the legal protections for solar installations, reasonable people would see that they were in the wrong. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening in the community center, and I prepared extensively. I brought copies of all the relevant state laws, documentation of our permits and inspections, photos of the installation from multiple angles, and even a breakdown of the environmental and economic benefits of solar power. The meeting was a disaster. Karen Morrison dominated the conversation from the moment I walked in, interrupting my presentation every few sentences to complain about how the panels were ruining the aesthetic character of the neighborhood and setting a bad precedent that would lead to every house looking like an industrial facility. The other board members mostly sat in silence, occasionally nodding when Karen made her points, but never engaging with any of the legal documentation I'd brought. When I tried to explain that state law specifically prohibited HOAs from banning solar installations, Karen cut me off and said that their covenants superseded state law because we'd agreed to them when we bought the house. Left that meeting knowing that diplomacy had failed. These people weren't interested in following the law or finding a reasonable compromise. They decided they didn't like my solar panels, and they were going to use whatever power they had to force me to remove them. The fines kept coming, doubling every month, and I started getting threatening letters about liens and foreclosure proceedings. Sarah was losing sleep, worried that we were going to lose the house we'd worked so hard to buy. That's when I stopped trying to reason with them and started doing research. If they wanted to play legal hardball, I needed to understand exactly what kind of ground I was standing on. I spent my evenings and weekends diving deep into property law, utility regulations, and the history of our neighborhood. I pulled the original plat maps from the county recorder's office, studied the utility easement agreements, and traced the ownership history of every lot in the subdivision going back to when it was first developed. What I found was interesting. Our neighborhood had been built in phases during the 1980s and early 1990s. With the utility infrastructure installed as each section was developed, the power lines that served the newer sections of the neighborhood, including Karen Morrison's house, ran through easements that crossed several of the older lots, including mine. These easements had been granted by the original landowner before the HOA was even established, and they gave the utility company specific rights to maintain power lines across private property. But here's what made it really interesting. The easement agreements weren't just between the utility company and the landowner. They were three-party agreements that also involved the property owner, giving us certain rights and responsibilities related to the easement area. One of those rights was the ability to revoke access to the easement under specific circumstances, including situations where the easement was being used to facilitate harassment or interference with the reasonable use of our property. Spent 2 weeks researching the legal precedents and consulting with a property attorney to make sure I understood the implications correctly. The more I learned, the more I realized that Karen and her HOA board had picked a fight with exactly the wrong person. They were using their power to harass me about a legal solar installation, threatening my family's financial security, and apparently had no idea that their own electrical service depended on rights of way that I controlled. The pieces were falling into place, but I wanted to be absolutely certain before I made my move. I hired a surveyor to verify the exact boundaries of the easement area and confirmed that the power lines serving the newer part of the neighborhood definitely crossed my property. I also had the attorney review all of my documentation and give me a formal opinion on my rights under the easement agreement. Everything checked out. I had the legal right to revoke easement access, And if I did, so about 30 houses in the neighborhood, including Karen Morrison's, would lose electrical service until the utility company could negotiate a new agreement or find an alternative route. The final HOA meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday evening in October. I'd been getting threatening letters for months by then, with fines that had accumulated to over $3,000 and increasingly aggressive language about foreclosure proceedings. Sarah was nervous about me going to the meeting, worried that the situation would escalate into some kind of confrontation. But I assured her that I planned to keep things quiet and professional. I arrived at the community center a few minutes early and took a seat in the back row. The meeting started with the usual routine business: budget discussions and landscaping committee reports, before Karen Morrison called for a special session to address the ongoing solar panel violation. She spent 10 minutes giving what amounted to a speech about property values and neighborhood standards, working herself up into a lather about how my stubborn refusal to comply with community standards was setting a dangerous precedent that would destroy the character of Willowbrook. Then she called for a formal vote to authorize legal action against me, including the possibility of forcing a sale of my property to recover the accumulated fines. The motion was seconded immediately, and it looked like it was going to pass without any discussion. That's when I stood up and asked if I could address the board before they voted. Karen looked annoyed, but the HOA's attorney whispered something to her about due process, and she grudgingly gave me 5 minutes to speak. I walked to the front of the room, opened my briefcase, and pulled out a folder containing the original utility easement agreement, the surveyor's report, and the legal opinion I'd obtained. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make any threats. I just explained in very calm and factual terms that the power line serving approximately 30 homes in the neighborhood crossed my property under an easement agreement. That gave me the right to revoke access if the easement was being used to facilitate harassment. The room was completely silent as I laid out the documentation. I showed them the surveyor's map, highlighted the relevant sections of the easement agreement, and explained that my attorney had confirmed my rights under state property law. Then I looked directly at Karen Morrison and said, "Mrs. Morrison, your house is one of the properties that would lose electrical service if I exercise my right to revoke this easement. So I'm going to make you a very simple offer. You can drop all fines and legal action related to my solar panels, which are legal under state law and properly permitted. Or you can explain to your neighbors why their power got shut off because you decided to pick a fight over renewable energy." The HOA's lawyer was frantically flipping through his own copies of the documents, and I could see him making notes and shaking his head. Karen Morrison's face had gone from red to white, and she was opening and closing her mouth like a fish out of water. The other board members were looking back and forth between her and the lawyer, clearly trying to figure out what was happening. I let the silence stretch for about 30 seconds before I continued. I moved to this neighborhood because I wanted to live quietly and peacefully. I installed solar panels on my house because it's my right as a property owner. It's good for the environment, and it saves my family money. You've spent months harassing me with illegal fines and threatening to take my home over something that doesn't affect you in any way. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to vote to dismiss all fines and legal action against me. You're going to acknowledge that solar panels are permitted in this neighborhood under state law. And then we're all going to go home and mind our own business. The vote was unanimous. The motion to take legal action against me was withdrawn. All fines were dismissed, and the board passed a resolution acknowledging that solar energy systems were protected under state law and could not be prohibited by HOA covenants. Karen Morrison resigned as president the following week, citing personal reasons, and moved out of the neighborhood 2 months later. The best part is how quiet it's been since then. My solar panels keep generating clean energy and saving us money every month. The new HOA board minds their own business and focuses on actual community issues like road maintenance and snow removal. And whenever I drive through the neighborhood, I notice that 3 more houses have installed solar panels of their own. Turns out a lot of people were interested in solar energy. They just needed to know it was actually allowed. Sometimes the best revenge is just proving that you were right all along. Sometimes it helps to hold a few trump cards that nobody else knows about.